found honest about the darkness, more perceptive of the light. The Magi, usually known as the three wise men or the three kings, are easily the most famous of the visitors who appear at Jesus' birth in the gospel accounts of the Christmas story. Whether or not one is a churchgoer or not, practically everyone has heard of them. Their bringing of gifts to the Christ child began a tradition that has linked them forever with the rite of holiday gift giving. Despite their great fame, however, there is only one short passage in the New Testament that tells of the Magi, and this account is remarkably vague. Notice the enormous gaps in the story. The wise men have no specific country of origin. They have come from the east. No number or names are given for the wise men, although 3 was destined to become the most common number because of the 3 gifts. The very phrase wise men is a rather poor translation of the Greek word, which elsewhere in the New Testament means magician in a clearly negative sense. Nevertheless, the legend of the Magi has fired the imagination of Christians since the earliest times. In art, the adoration of the Magi appeared earlier and far more frequently than any other scene of Jesus' birth and infancy, including images of the babe itself. The artistic evidence suggests that the early church attributed great theological importance to the story of Jesus' first visitors, an importance not overtly stated in a gospel account marked by omens and dreams, astrological signs and precious gifts, fear and flight. As for me personally, I don't remember this story making any kind of impression upon me as a boy. I recall singing hymns that celebrated we 3 kings of Orient, but my own parents did not go to church, and my attendance at Mass was marked by a persistent sense of being an alien among the devout, a poor ruffian who failed to possess the keys necessary to enter the world of salvation history. A territory marked by votive candles I never lit, rosaries I never possessed, and stations of the cross that we public school Catholics lack the Rosetta Stone to decode. In other words, as a boy lad growing up, I lacked any theological container to hold on to the pieces of scripture and numinous experiences I may have encountered. As for the story in Matthew, the wise men, like all the other figures in the biblical story, seem to appear out of nowhere and then disappear into nothingness. I did not grow up in a very religious family. We didn't use God language to define our hopes or to interpret our successes and our failures. Life was perceived as a crapshoot, and my dad made it clear that the die was stacked against folks like us who didn't have much money. Christmas, with its amped up expectation of good tidings, and the awkward visits to financially secure relatives with large stacks of gifts piled around well-lit trees, was less a time of thanksgiving and worship than an opportunity for envy and shame. My father led the charge. He was at his worst during the holidays. One year, as Christmas approached, my mother grew more and more desperate with my father to get a tree. My mom didn't drive, and her wishes were usually dependent on my father. Midday, on Christmas Eve, my mother blasted my father, using the 7 of us kids as her ammunition. My father finally relented, tramped out of the house, and returned an hour later with a pathetic-looking spruce tree. The tree was tall, but skinny and barren. There were large vacant spaces between the branches, giant holes of air. My father sent me downstairs to get his handsaw and a drill. By the time I returned, all of my brothers and sisters had gathered around the tree, staring in disbelief. My father, desperate to redeem the scrawny mess before us, began to cut off branches from the fuller section of the tree, and drilling holes into the trunk, began grafting the cut off branches into the vacant spaces. My mother was not impressed. She started crying, telling my father he had ruined Christmas for the family. I'll never forget my father's response. His body halfway inside the tree, my father declared, "There's nothing wrong with this goddamn tree." In time, I came to love the perfectly worded irony of those words, which provided me a method of distancing myself from the pain. Family fights were not a constant presence in my growing up years. There were long stretches during which my mom and dad got along fine, making food together, telling us kids stories of their childhoods in the UP. But Christmas holidays seemed to bring out the worst in their relationship. I recall numerous days when we children were woken in the early morning by my parents fighting downstairs in the kitchen. I remember just wanting the fighting to stop. I'd put my pillow over my ears in efforts to silence the yelling. My brothers and sisters always sided with my mother in these disputes. I, on the other hand, blamed her. If only she would stop attacking my father, I thought, things wouldn't be so bad. Of course, I was unwilling to acknowledge what my other family members saw, that the problem was my father and his unwillingness to be responsible. That my mother's nagging, in fact, was driven by her desperate attempts to keep our family afloat. Creditors were at the door while my father was spending money at the racetrack, returning home with promises of striking it big. One morning, we children were woken up by the loud crash of a bowl of oatmeal splintering against the kitchen wall. Apparently, my mother had cooked the oatmeal too long, and according to my father's standards, it was burnt. My oldest sister was the religious one in our family. When things got really bad, she would kneel before a crucifix, a religious icon she herself had placed on a wall in her bedroom, praying to it that my parents would stop fighting. I vividly recall thinking that her prayers weren't able to do anything at all. In time, I came to see them as utterly futile. I came to believe that her words never reached heaven, that the chasm was too wide. For the God I visited at 8 o'clock Mass at St. Mary Magdalene, an ethereal figure that was imaged at the front of the church as floating in space, surrounded by clouds, gazing out upon the congregation with an indecipherable countenance, was irrelevant to our plight. Either because he was too busy attending to more important problems or more important people, or because he was too disembodied to stay my father's hand when he raised it to take a drink. And in some mysterious way, I came to believe that I understood my father in ways that my sister and my brothers, my mom, and my father's judgmental siblings could not. We too shared something, I thought, though I had no words to name it. That naming came years later, when an 11th grade English teacher, Mrs. Mattia, kept me after class one day, and as I stood next to her, asked me why I never seemed to smile. Why was I so sad, she asked. I had nothing to say. Though I did smile and laugh and love life, there was an essential part of me that she had named, a part of me that I had somehow inherited from my dad. A few years ago, I picked up a book on mathematics, hoping to use some of its ideas in a course I teach called Theory of Knowledge. The book, entitled The Universe in the Teacup, is an effort of a noted mathematician, C.K. Cole, to explain what math actually is, to take us layfolk behind those complex formulae, to show us what it is mathematicians actually do. Cole argues that the mathematical mind is a specialized tool that's very good at highlighting the patterns that lie underneath the surface of things. It makes the invisible visible, she claims, much like an X-ray does. She writes, mathematics is a language that allows us to translate the complexity of the world into manageable patterns. In a sense, it works like turning off the house lights in a theater, the better to see a movie. Certainly, she says, something is lost when the lights go down. You can no longer see the faces around you or the inlaid patterns on the ceiling, but you gain a far better view of the subject at hand. I am one of those people who seem preoccupied by the very details in the movie house that the mathematical mind ignores when the lights go down. The face of the little girl sitting in the next row, staring transfixed at the movie screen. I am preoccupied by those things you lose when you look for abstract patterns. I seem to be always drawn to concrete particulars. At their best, these particulars point to mysteries that can't be named. At their most frightening, these particulars don't seem to point to anything at all. They are just the smashed bowl on the floor, my mom on her hands and knees picking up the pieces. They are my father at my wedding, in the moment set aside for the parents of the bridal couple to offer their blessing, pausing, feeling awkward at being placed in the spotlight, yet feeling obligated to say something, simply stating, good luck. Those two words have always seemed utterly appropriate to me. My father, a World War II vet with countless medals and unnamed psychic scars, unable to add to the accumulation of reassurances expected during a wedding ceremony. Particulars are raw, unruly things. Meanings pulsate from them. Theology, for me at least, often seems to impose meaning on things, offering an order that seems unwarranted by the details. Like some of you, I have a hard time getting things religious to adhere to me. The sovereignty of God, life after death, everything working for the good for those that love the Lord. Even the very idea that there's something more than the random collision of things. On some nights, looking up at the night sky, I, like the French philosopher Pascal, find the eternal silences of these infinite spaces terrifies me. But of course, there are other nights when the evening sky is glorious, and its silence suggests a resounding affirmation that needs no defense. I recall evenings sitting on the front porch with my mother and father as the sun goes down over Peggy Brujan's house and planes fly overhead one after another, making their way safely to Detroit Metropolitan Airport. On one of these pleasant nights, my dad turns down the volume on the Tigers game we're listening to and asks my mother if she might like to learn how to drive that summer. She smiles and says she doesn't think so, at least not yet. And they go on talking about making chili together the next day. My mom reaches down and scratches my head, asks my father if he'd be willing to pick up some extra meat from the market. All is quiet, all is calm. The night sky is never really dark in Allen Park, Michigan. To the east, the mills at McLeod Steel flare up every few minutes, and the evening sky glows a bright orange. I ask my dad if we can turn the ball game back on. He looks at my mom, and she defers to my wishes. And Ernie Harwell's voice flows out across the lawn again, drawing us into the ballpark, conjuring up Rocky Colavito, knocking dirt from his spikes as he prepares to step into the batter's box, carrying in his bat the promise of a late inning rally. For some religious convictions, I live on the faith of others. I don't need to sort them all out in order for me to be carried or sustained by them. My skepticism, my doubts, are not the final word. I have come to realize I live in something much bigger than my own individual understandings, my own personal reasonings, my own individual beliefs. The gift of a community faith extends beyond good deeds. I am also, in a sense, redeemed by the faith of others. For I am not some island, some piece of flotsam, adrift in some vast, lonely sea. I exist in community, depending upon others, like you, for my very existence, including religious belief and practice. I feed on the hope possessed by others, as I hope they, at times, feed upon mine. My faith in God, in the good, in the possibility of justice being done, is somehow made stronger by the image of some strange beach fish Don brings to us on a Sunday morning, as well as the countless prison visitations of Tim and Chris and Verna. This thing we do called believing is done together, each with our limited vision, each with us carrying the wounds of prior generations, while also being held and sustained in the faithfulness of other people, some of whom we can't even remember or name. Each of us is sustained by a faith tradition that preceded us and will far outlive us. And most importantly, each of us is sustained by a God in whom, as the Apostle Paul claimed, we live and move and have our being, regardless of whether I or we at any given moment recognize him or not. Matthew concludes his account of the wise men with their being divinely warned in a dream to avoid Herod and to depart for their own country another way. And we readers of Scripture hear of them no more. No narration of our triumphant return to the east, no statement explaining the theological significance of their visitation. Of course, numerous writers have attempted to fill the void, most notably T.S. Eliot in his poem, The Journey of the Magi. There, one of the Magi narrates a journey back home, concluding the poem with the words, "We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I am no longer a boy living in that small house in downriver Detroit, but I still sometimes return to those places, those kingdoms where alien people clutched their gods. And I am left to wonder at how very much the God of the living was present in that old dispensation, no matter how rarely I heard his name spoken or how rarely I noticed candles that were being lit for me.
Let us ponder. Let us offer our gifts.
As the plate is being passed, plates are being passed, turn to 388 in your hymnal. 388.
May it be so. Amen. We ponder in our hearts, we wrestle with these ancient texts of earthy mystery, always in conversation with every day. So let's let the Spirit lift up in our thoughts and perhaps in our words what we are noticing, what we are treasuring, or where we are wrestling.
I think your message was very appropriate on Epiphany. To me, it seemed like a revelation of grace in your sharing from your particular experience growing up. But one thing I heard today was you have a gift or a burden of seeing all of the companioning details around us, including our companioning community. And it's not maybe as clear as a mathematical model or a theological model. It's more mixed. It's a lot of darkness in it. But just like the night sky can be different from one night to the next, I think you have an eye for looking at those revelations of grace in the inapparent and humble details around us and in each other. So thank you very much.
Donald, I really appreciate your emphasis on how the community holds our faith at different points. And then hearing your family experience, I grew up in a family that was very religious, almost sometimes unhealthily religious. And what I found I've needed to do at some points is I've needed to let the community hold my faith while I explore the edges of things. And with the same experience, the community holds the faith while I'm doing some of my exploring.
I've all heard the expression, the devil is in the details. I never liked that expression. And one of the reasons that I've grown into as an adult is that I believe that God is in the details. And thank you, Donald, for helping us to have words for that, noticing where God is and that vast expanse between suffering and goodness that the poet Naomi Shihab Nye says is where kindness plays.